Good evening. Great to have you all here. And dear Deborah Lipstadt, it's a great honor to have you here. Welcome. Let's give you an applause. It's such a great, we've been looking forward to having you. People have prepared, they have gone to the libraries, lent the books or found the books in their shelves and brought them for you to sign tonight. Anyway, my name is Guri Hjeltnes. I'm a director of the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies here in Oslo. And together with the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University, we are conducting this series this fall, happily supported by the ECPO Foundation. We're really grateful that ECPO has supported us the whole semester. And maybe as a Christmas gift, there will be another semester. Whether we don't know. We cannot promise yet. But anyway, this is the 5th evening. And it's been a long trip. The whole idea was to have an international perspective on Second World War. Because it's 80 years since the outbreak of the war this year. And next year, as you know, there will be a big celebration for the liberation of the ending of the Second World War all over the world. It already started, as you know, here in Norway, up north, this October, and it's all over the world. And that is why the University of Tromsø and the Holocaust Center decided to have this series, supported then also eagerly by the ECPO Foundation. We do, as we always do, this will be 2 hours and sweet. If something happens, there are 3 exits. 1, 2, 3. So please remember, there are food and soft drinks, so please help yourself, but be quiet and discreet, so we can listen to the fabulous lecture you will listen to. First, Deborah Lipstadt will talk, and then there will be 2 professors here from the University of Oslo commenting. That will be Professor Bernt Hagtvet and Professor Hans-Petter Graver. And afterward, there will be a talk here conducted by my good colleague, Marianne Neerland Soleim from the University of Tromsø, associate professor there, and a colleague of Tom Christiansen, so you all met this semester. So we will be actually 5 people on the scene, and of course, as always, we will open the floor and the possibilities for you to ask questions and comments. Deborah Esther Lipstadt, born 1947. I mean, we found you all over, Deborah. American historian, known for the books Denying the Holocaust, History on Trial, My Day in Court with the Holocaust Denier, the Eichmann Trial, and Anti-Semitism Here and Now, actually published this year. And Deborah Lipstadt wanted a guided tour of Oslo yesterday, and she was actually guided around, and they dropped by a Tromsø bokhandel, and then she found her own book in the shelves, and happily sent it to her publisher. Anyway, since 1993, Professor Lipstadt has been professor of modern Jewish history and Holocaust studies at Emory University at Atlanta, Georgia, United States, and long before that, a long academic career. And she was a really important consultant to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And in 1994, President Bill Clinton appointed her to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, and she served 2 terms. Born in New York City, she told us, daughter of Miriam and Erwin Lipstadt, but the mother born in Canada, and her father a salesman born in Germany. And when she came to the Holocaust Center today for a guided tour, I introduced her to a colleague of us. I said, she's from Germany. And she said, where do you come from? I'm from Hamburg. And then Deborah Lipstadt said, my grandparents are buried at the Jewish cemetery in Hamburg. So the world is small, but we are so glad you are here. Deborah Lipstadt, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. It is a pleasure being here. I've been in Oslo less than 48 hours. I leave tomorrow morning, but my hope is that it will not be the last time, because while I've seen many things, I know there's more yet to see. Many years ago, when I was a consultant to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, long before the ground had been broken, long before the building had been opened, I sat in a meeting as an observer of the content committee. Of course, the museum was being designed by professionals, but because of the sensitivity, and particularly the sensitivity and the great interest of survivors, they had formed a content committee made up not only of survivors, academics, people interested in the topic, to review the plans for the permanent exhibition, the content of the permanent exhibition. And I was there because I was consulting on the part of the exhibition that was America and the Holocaust. But there was going to be a very interesting meeting, and I was urged to sit in. And that was a meeting to decide on whether the human hair that had been given to the museum, or given as a permanent loan to the museum by the Auschwitz Museum, would be on display. The designers had designed a case for it, a place to put it. They had even designed a sort of wall in front of it, thinking that it was such a profound thing to see that some families going through, maybe with younger children, not little children, but even teenagers, would not want to see it, or some people would not want to see it, so you would have to make a detour to see it. But as the discussion about the display of the hair went on, some survivors raised some questions. So the committee was meeting to make a final recommendation to the heads of the museum and the people planning it, whether it should be shown or not. Participating in the meeting, a member of the content committee, was Professor Raoul Hilberg. And if you know anything about the history of the Holocaust, you know that he was one of the most significant figures in, and of course plays a role in the Eichmann Trial in an indirect way, in determining and studying and laying out for us how the destruction process operated. And at that point, his book was the major book on the nature of the destruction process. And he spoke at the meeting, and he very much urged that it be on display, because he said, this shows the industrialization of the killing. That it was not just mass killing, but that it was an industrial effort, that every body part was to be used in a way that would produce a profit for the SS and by extension for Germany, Nazi Germany and the Third Reich. And the conversation was quite heated. People talked about the fact that it wouldn't be traumatic to children. It would be that the permanent exhibition, children under 12 weren't supposed to come in anyway, a fairly active debate. But towards the end of the conversation, two women stood up to make comments, both of them survivors of Auschwitz. And one of them said, that could have been my mother's hair, and she never gave you permission to display it. And the other one, as she was, a friend had made the comment, she was about to sit down, the other one said, it could have been my hair. That was the end of the deliberations. There wasn't going to be any vote taken. But I knew at that point, as did virtually everyone in the room, that that hair would not be on display. And today in the Holocaust Museum, there is a photograph of the hair. The hair itself sits in a storeroom at another location with other artifacts. The fact of that decision is, to my mind, a result of the Eichmann Trial. And I hope to make that clear in my presentation and in our conversation tonight. On May 23rd, 1960, David Ben-Gurion walked into the Israeli Knesset. People knew that some sort of special announcement was being made, but they didn't know what it was. And he informed the Knesset that a short time ago, one of the great Nazi war criminals, Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible together with the Nazi leaders for what was called the final solution, was discovered by Israeli security forces. He's under arrest in Israel, and he will be shortly brought to trial. The news went through Israel like a bombshell, and through the rest of the world, people were amazed that this had happened. Who was Eichmann? Who was Adolf Eichmann? And how did he end up in an Israeli jail in Akko, or Israeli prison, and eventually be put on trial in Israel? Contrary to the way Ben Gurion suggested it and the way it was to be presented at the trial, he was not one of the designers, if one could use that term, of the final solution. Or to speak in a more contemporary parlance, he was not one of the CEOs, chief executive officers of the Holocaust, but he was one of the chief operating officers of the Holocaust. He didn't make the decisions, but he carried them out and was responsible for the death, for the murder of over 1 million people. Now, Eichmann had been mentioned at the Nuremberg trials, but he managed to hide in Germany with the help of a number of former Nazis and also the help of the Catholic Church. And then as his name became more and more known and discussed at Nuremberg, as one of his assistants was arrested, he decided that it was the best thing for him to leave Europe with the help of the Vatican, with the help of others. He took a boat and went to Argentina. He lived there, worked there in a fairly low-level job at the Mercedes-Benz plant, again, owned by a German. They knew full well who they were hiring. It wasn't, though he changed his name to Ricardo Clement, certainly the manager of the plant, the owner of the plant, knew who he was. How was he eventually found? Through a number of different sources. First of all, the Argentinians knew he was there. The Argentinian police knew he was there. The Argentine was not an open democratic society, and they kept close track on who was there. And during the 50s, he met with German expats living in Argentina, and he talked about what he did. So it was known that he was there, certainly by the Argentinian police, and at times he was being followed. And there's even good indication that on the night of his capture, the Argentinian police saw it happening but didn't intervene. The German embassy, and consequently the German Foreign Office, knew he was there. When I was, a number of years ago, I spoke at a conference on the 50th anniversary of the trial, and we were hosted by the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office showed us the book in which the embassy in Buenos Aires registered people who were living there, you would come and you would register your children to make sure that their German citizenship stayed intact, that the embassy knew they were there, etc. And Vera Eichmann, who went as Vera Clement, Eichmann's wife, brought her 2 children there, and they were registered under the name Eichmann. So right there in the book, you see the name Eichmann. So again, no surprise. The CIA knew he was there. But it wasn't, this was the height of the Cold War. There was no reason to start pressuring the Argentinians to bring him to trial or anything. It was just more convenient to ignore it. Eventually, first of all, one of his sons is friendly with the last name Eichmann, friendly with a young woman in Argentina. They both go to the same school, whose father had left Germany during the 30s, a Jew, and he heard the name and he found this very interesting and who it was, and they find some information and pass the information on to Fritz Bauer, the Attorney General, so to speak, of Hesse, who himself had been in a concentration camp in the 30s as a social democrat. He was a Jew. He spent most of the war in Sweden, but after the war, Willy Brandt urged him to come back to Germany to make sure that those who had perpetrated this would be brought to trial, and he does go back. I'm sure many of you know about Fritz Bauer. Information comes to Fritz Bauer, too, that Eichmann is there, but Fritz Bauer, here he is, an official of Hesse, doesn't give the information to the German security officials and security agencies. Why? Because he fears, and with good reason, because the same thing had happened with Mengele, that if he tells them, somebody's going to warn Eichmann and Eichmann is going to disappear. So instead, he gives the information to the Israelis, the Israeli representative in Germany. Israel at that point did not yet have diplomatic relations with Germany. Israel gets the information. Israel at that point is an emerging, very poor country, limited resources, and the head of the security forces makes a calculation. Should we go and be chasing down enemies of the Jewish people who did something in the past, or protecting ourselves against contemporary enemies of the Jewish state? And he just let it lie dormant. Eventually, an Israeli operative who was in Argentina was given the address on Garibaldi Street. Go and look at this house. We're told that this is where Eichmann lives. He goes to the house. He says, this is a cinder block house. May not even have running water, seems to have only recently gotten electricity. This could not be the home of the man who engineered the murder of over 1 million Jews, who took the property of Jews in Hungary, etc. So they let it drop. Eventually, Fritz Bauer, gets more information confirming that this indeed is Eichmann, and he makes an official trip to Israel. Officially, it's a diplomatic, official trip. But while he's there, he meets with the head of the Israeli security forces and says something to the effect, I don't know if he actually said this, but this was the way it was reported, a flat-footed German policeman could have found this man in 2 weeks, and you haven't done so. And he gives them additional information confirming this indeed is Eichmann. At that point, Isser Harel, who's the head of the Secret Service and the security services in Israel, goes to David Ben-Gurion and gives him the information. And here is a very important point. Ben-Gurion could easily have said, take some of your guys, go down there, find him, let him end up in a ditch. You don't have to plant an Israeli flag on top of him to say we were here, but let him end up that way, and that will be a message to all the other thousands of German perpetrators who are hiding in different places, not to sleep so easy in their beds. But Ben-Gurion doesn't say that. Ben-Gurion says, go there, find him, capture him, bring him back, and we will put him on trial, and we will give him the justice he never allowed to any of his victims. And that, in fact, is what they do. They kidnap him. They manage to spirit him out of the country and bring him to Israel. He's taken to the prison in Akko, north of Haifa. And then Israel suddenly realized it's got a lot of the officials, Ben-Gurion and others, that decisions have to be made. Who is going to try him? Where is the trial going to be? Who is going to defend him? Who is going to prosecute him, etc.? And those are all questions that have to be dealt with. But first, the Argentinians go to the Security Council, very upset that this has happened. Their sovereignty has been violated, etc. The representative, the Argentinian representative at the UN at that point was someone who actually had been quite sympathetic to the Nazis. And in his presentation at the Security Council, he equated Jews who fled the Nazis and took shelter in Argentina with Nazi war criminals who fled punishment. And he said both of them have benefited from our country's liberal admissions policy, and had we been more vigilant, we might have found the perpetrators, the criminals, and we might have found these Jews who came in under questionable circumstances. Well, so he's essentially equating the victims and the perpetrators. Golda Meir, the Israeli foreign secretary, foreign minister at that point, who has come to the UN to present Israel's case, of course, is furious. She finds it quite extraordinary that he would make this comparison. And then she asks, she apologizes for Israel's actions, but she says, what is a greater threat to peace? Israel having kidnapped him, or Eichmann living at large, Eichmann living unpunished. I think it's also important to recognize, and maybe you here in Norway have a better understanding of this than certainly people in North America, that at this stage, there were, certainly in the late 50s, but maybe even in the early 60s, there were still those who thought maybe there was a chance of a reemergence of some sort of Nazi element in Germany. And of course, Eichmann had been meeting with German expats through the 50s in Argentina, talking about this. Eventually, the United States negotiates a compromise. Israel apologizes to Argentina, and Argentina doesn't demand that Eichmann be returned. Now, Israel has said, we're going to try him. Even before any of the decisions are made as to where and how the trial will be, of course, there are many people who are very critical of this. One of the questions that is asked by many press elements and throughout the world is, how can Jewish judges be impartial? What was striking about this question, of course, no one asked that about Nuremberg, or almost no one asked it about Nuremberg, and no one asked it certainly about the Polish trials or the Czech trials when they held their trials. Others argued this is a case that should be heard by the World Court. Of course, the World Court only hears cases between nations, and this was not a case that would be heard naturally by them. The interesting thing also is Germany. Some people said, well, Germany should try him. The last thing Konrad Adenauer wanted was to have this trial in Germany. Because Eichmann would stand up there and say, you're charging me? The head of your chancellery is Globke. Globke was helped write the Nuremberg laws, the details of the Nuremberg laws. Globke also was the person when the decision was made, as I saw this morning in the display at the center, when the decision was made that Jews had to add the name Isaac and Sarah to their names, there were exemptions for that law. The exemptions for that law was if you had an overtly Jewish name, you didn't have to add that as a middle name. Globke made up the list of overtly Jewish names. So you sort of imagine him sitting at his desk. Mendele, yeah, that's a good Jewish name. Joseph, that's too common, so we'll make, he was highly involved, and now he was running Adenauer's chancellery, and many others. He was just one of those people. Most of the leading positions in the Foreign Office in the early 60s were held by people who had worked under the Nazis, and this was true in many other offices. So the last thing Adenauer wanted was to have this trial in Germany. In fact, Adenauer found an ally in Ben-Gurion who urged the prosecutor later on, once the plans for the trial are underway, said, every time you refer to Germany during the trial, please refer to Nazi Germany. Because Ben-Gurion at that point was trying to develop closer relations with Adenauer. It was prior to the establishment of relations, but still, and this, i.e., this is a new Germany. Then, of course, one of the criticisms was, what standing does Israel have to try this man? It didn't exist then. It wasn't, their citizens didn't exist, so how could it be their citizens who were killed? Ben-Gurion has a response for this. He says, had French citizens been slaughtered because they were French, no one would question France's right to pursue justice. The Shoah victims were singled out because they were Jews. And Israel goes ahead. The fact is nobody else wants to try him, so Israel goes ahead. Not that I think if there had been anyone else who wanted to try him, they would have given it up. They felt this was really exceptionally important. So then the question is, who will be the judge? Technically, under Israeli law, since the trial was going to be held in Jerusalem, it should have been the president of the Jerusalem District Court, a judge by the last name of Halevi. But the problem was Halevi had been a judge in the Kastner trial. The Kastner trial had taken place in the mid-50s. Israel Kastner had been the one who, a Hungarian Jew, who had worked with Eichmann on getting a trainload of Jews out of Hungary. He had really been Eichmann's conduit to the Jewish community. There are many people who held him responsible for not warning people what was happening, not telling them that they could have gone into hiding, they could have escaped. He was a controversial figure, and at one point, he was suing someone for having libeled him. He worked for the Israeli ministry, and the ministry said, this person has called you a Nazi or a Nazi collaborator, and so he was suing him for libel. And the judge in the case, Halevi, found for the person who had accused Kastner of doing these terrible things. And in his decision, he described Kastner, Judge Halevi, as someone who sold his soul to the devil. So to have a person who had already said in a decision, working with this man was a collaborator and he had already declared the Nazis as the devil, would have been very hard to have him sit in at least the chief judges. It was going to be Israel doesn't have jury trials, but it has, for these kind of situations, this qualified for a judicial tribunal, 3 judges, for him to be the chief judge. Now, since Eichmann was being tried, and I should probably mention this earlier, under a law that was passed in 1950, and it was called the Law Against Nazi Criminals and Their Collaborators. The Knesset had passed this law not in the expectation that they were going to find any Nazis to try. It wasn't to try Nazis. I mean, on one hand, it was to bring Israel into coordination with other European countries which had similar laws, but the real reason was because people would get on the bus in Tel Aviv or be on the beach in Haifa or whatever and say, that's the person who was the capo in my barracks. That was the Jewish policeman in the ghetto who arrested my parents. I know that person. He's the one who got himself off on a list to be saved, and my family went to the camps. So they needed some process to try these people. And there were a number of trials of these people who were accused. But this law was one of the few Israel eliminated the death penalty in 1953-54. This was one of the few laws that still had the death penalty. So when the problem was faced with Halevi, how can you have him as the head of the tribunal and say you're giving this man a fair trial? So the Knesset goes into session, and it says if there's a case being heard where it's possible for someone to get the death penalty, the chief judge has to be a member of the high court, the highest court in Israel. Sort of retroactive. So that pushed Halevi into a secondary place on the tribunal, and Moshe Landau became the chief justice of the tribunal. And the third judge was a judge from Tel Aviv, Raveh. They were all German-born. German was their mother tongue. They were all educated in either German law schools or in Oxford or Cambridge, and considered very fine jurists. But then the question was, who was going to prosecute? Well, officially, the Attorney General does the prosecution, but the Israeli Attorney General at that point, Gideon Hausner, had been the 3rd or 4th choice for Attorney General. There have been all sorts of political machinations. Nothing has changed in Israel in terms of that. Since then, they just announced new elections today. But he was a commercial lawyer in Tel Aviv, and everybody thought he would be the official, but he would appoint someone in his office who was used to trying criminal cases. He said, no, I'm going to try this case. So Gideon Hausner becomes the prosecutor. Then the question is, who was going to defend Eichmann? And Israel was intent on him having a good defense. They said, because if he doesn't have a good defense, it's a show trial. Remember, this is post-Stalin, but still, we are not going to put a show trial. We want this to be a fair trial. There were some Germans who volunteered, but they all had been members of the Nazi Party. And Israel said, well, we do want him to have a fair trial, but we're not having a Nazi come into our courtroom. So there were Israelis. There were quite a few Israeli lawyers who stepped forward. They said, we have no sympathy for Eichmann, but he has to have a fair trial. He has to have a defense. Israel was afraid for the safety of any Israeli lawyer who would represent him. They thought somebody's relative, somebody who had lost his entire family, would have a very hard time differentiating between the person on trial and the person defending him, which is still the case today. We just had an instance of that in the United States with a law professor at Harvard who said he represented some of the people who have been charged with sexual abuse of women in their offices, etc. And he said, look, that's my job as a lawyer, but many people felt he shouldn't have done that. So it's still something that goes on. So Finally, a lawyer named Servatius, who had defended some of the people being prosecuted at Nuremberg, a German lawyer who had not been a member of the Nazi Party, said he would do it. The Israelis said okay. But then the question was, who would pay for his defense? The Eichmann family said, we don't have the money, we can't afford it. So Israel said, we will pay, and they paid for the defense. So everything is set up. Then they need a place to have the trial. At that point, the Jerusalem courts were tiny little rooms in what was called the Russian compound in the center of Israel. They found a theater that was under construction called the House of the People, Beit Ha'am, and Ben-Gurion's assistant, Teddy Kollek, who will go on to a very distinguished history as the mayor of Jerusalem, meets with the people building Beit Ha'am, and they make certain adjustments to take out, to look a little less as a theater, and that's where it was held. Now, meanwhile, Eichmann is being held in Akko, and he's under very strict guard. For 24 hours a day, he is watched by a guard. There is another guard who watches the guard who's watching him, and a third guard who watches the second guard. None of these guards speak German. None of them have lost relatives in the Shoah. So they want to take no chance that someone is going to do something untoward. Now, then the questioning of Eichmann begins by a sergeant, a young sergeant, also born in Germany, who had come to Israel in the 30s. And Eichmann's background emerges. Who was Eichmann? Eichmann, as I said, was not the chief conceptualizer of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. But what he was, actually born in Austria, and as a young man, he needs a job, and through the help of a relative who was friendly with the Jewish owner of a company, he gets hired. The family was quite anti-Semitic, but they didn't let their anti-Semitism stand in their way of when their son needed a job and using that. He gets a job in the building of supplying petrol stations that are being built. This is the late 20s, early 30s. People are getting cars, you need petrol stations, and he is becomes a very good manager at working out how to keep these stations supplied, how to make sure they're ready on time, etc. He eventually will move to Germany, and initially he's what some historians have called the weekend Nazi. You know, he on a chance, he goes to hear a leading member of the SS give a talk, and he just signs a membership card. But once the Nazis come to power in 1933, he becomes more active. First, he has very menial jobs, figuring out files, alphabetizing things, but then he takes a short trip to Palestine to supposedly spy out on the Zionists. He's there for a day. The British realize that he is a Nazi, and they send him out right away. But what he does do is he creates this big report on the Zionist movement. It is a total fantasy. Shaul, the Pulitzer Prize-winning and great historian Shaul Friedlander, says he couldn't find a conspiracy, so he created one. And he talks about the Zionists having places to build arms and factories, and none of which was there any truth. But he comes to the attention of the higher-ranking SS officers. Now, his big break, so to speak, will be right after the Anschluss, March 1938. The German, the Austrians like to talk about it as the German invasion of Austria. It was a very, they were met with flowers and candy and cheers when they rolled in. But within a few days after the Anschluss, Eichmann is sent to Vienna to organize the deportation of the Jews. He uses the Rothschild Palais as his place for doing this, and someone who was an Austrian, Viennese Jew, described it as Jews would come into that building with possessions, with a home, with maybe a business, with a bank account, whatever, and they would go through the process and they would come out the other end with nothing except an exit visa. And Eichmann was the one who organized this and ran it in a very, very severe manner. Some Viennese Jews who eventually give testimony at the trial described how when they would, these very distinguished gentlemen, when they would go to meet with them, he would sit behind his desk. He's in his early 30s at this point, and they would have to stand. He would make them move back a couple of feet. At one point, he put up a velvet rope, and they would have to stand behind the velvet rope, etc. And that's when he comes to the attention of those who will eventually plan and carry out the Shoah, and he will become part of this. Now, what are the scope of the charges to be brought against him? There are quite a few charges, including his treatment of the Roma and the Sinti, of non-Jewish victims, treatment of Yugoslavs, etc., non-Jews, Yugoslav non-Jews. But in contrast to Nuremberg, Hausner makes the centerpiece of the indictment his crimes against the Jewish people. At Nuremberg, that had been a sidebar, an ancillary thing, and here it was switched around. So it was the same, similar charges in terms of crimes against humanity, but the emphasis was switched from Nuremberg. The trial opens in April 1961, just a year after he has been captured and brought to Israel. And in the opening of the trial, Servatius, his lawyer, claims that this is retroactive justice. The response of Hausner is so was Nuremberg. Any war crimes trial that takes place afterwards is going to be a retroactive or fall into that category. Hausner then stands up to speak, and he begins, even before he begins with his dramatic opening, with a series of precedents of other trials which could be compared to this, of legal actions. It's a very legalese presentation, which upsets the hundreds of journalists. There are more journalists in that courtroom, in that theater, which has become the courtroom on the opening day of the Eichmann trial, than there were at Nuremberg, which makes sense. Nuremberg happens right after the war, etc. But the press quickly finds something else going on. Many of them leave. It's the same time as the Bay of Pigs, the American invasion of Cuba, and also the same time, 2 days later, Yuri Gagarin is shot into space. But in his opening statement, Hausner lays out both what is correct about Eichmann and what is incorrect. He depicts him as being the mastermind of the Shoah, which he was not. He wasn't involved in most of the ghettos in the East, or any of the ghettos in the East. He was involved in the shootings on the Eastern Front, but he did play an important role. But what Hausner does get right is that this was a man who did his job with a zeal and a devotion that was unparalleled, unmatched. At one point, he is ordered in Hungary to stop the deportations towards the end of the war. He pushes to get another train out. At another point, he's asked by the Italians about a Jewish woman who's married to a non-Jewish Italian. She's already in a ghetto. And this non-Jewish Italian family has good political connections, and the Italians want her released to be reunited with her husband. He quickly has her deported to a death camp. On another occasion, he's told to deport people from one region. He deports from yet another region. Yet another instance, one Jew manages to get a passport from a South American country, which allow him to leave Germany. He immediately has him arrested and deported. So he's not, some mealy-mouthed bureaucrat just following orders. He's taking initiative, and Hausner shows this repeatedly during the trial. But I think one of the most compelling things about the trial is how Hausner decides he's going to present his case. And he's going to use a two-pronged approach. One prong will be the Nuremberg documents. He goes through the Nuremberg documents extensively, and he builds a case built on documents. And he could have just done that, and the judges would have been much happier had he done that. But he does something else. At the suggestion of a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, a woman who was working then at Yad Vashem, Rachel Auerbach, She had been part, for those of you who know the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Oneg Shabbos group, the group that documented the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the few surviving members. She comes to Hausner and she says, use witnesses. Find people with good stories to tell. Now, she thinks he's only going to find people from the killing phase, but Hausner decides to tell the whole history of the Shoah, documents and witnesses, even parts of the history that, of course, Eichmann had no role in. She thinks he's just going to call a few witnesses. Hausner, in the end, calls about 110 witnesses, 105 witnesses, of whom well over, I think, 96, 97 are survivors. So for the first time, you're getting a public airing of the story told in the first person singular. This is my story. This is what happened to me. And that's why I began the story with the hair, because that's the voice of the survivors. Now, some people like to say that prior to the Eichmann trial, the survivors never spoke about what happened to them. That's not true. Many spoke, some didn't, but some did. Many wrote their memoirs. In fact, at the same time as the trial, a young journalist, a Hungarian who had ended up in France, had written his memoirs, named Elie Wiesel, tries to find an American publisher for his memoirs, and for his book, which is going to become Night. And most American publishers turn it down. One doesn't, and I'm sure they were very happy with that decision. But in the rejection letters, a number of them write, well, it's an interesting story, but there's so many other stories like this, there's so many other memoirs like this, that this is just a repetition of what we already know. I tell that story just to say that this idea that nobody spoke is not true. But what hadn't happened before is this standing in the witness dock and the telling their story publicly. The trial is being televised. It's the first trial ever it's recorded, obviously not live. They make holes in the wall because the judges do not want cameras in the courtroom. They make holes in the wall so it's screened, and you can see they're online. Many of the some were taped over after they're shown. And each night the films would be sent out at the end of the day. One would go to, the plane would fly to London. From there, a set would go to the United States, and a set would go to Germany, where they were also shown in Germany with a great impact. But one of the things that, Eichmann's defense is, I was just following orders, I was just a low-level clerk, etc. And one of the things that Hausner repeatedly shows of his boasting of his power, how powerful he was, how strong he was, how my office here, my office in Paris, my office in Berlin, my office in Athens, eventually my office in Budapest, etc. And this was a powerful, powerful individual. But one of the most compelling things, and when I return to the issue of the witnesses and read you a little bit from their testimony, is what's some of the testimony of the witnesses. Because even today, in the distance of so many years, it is very compelling to hear it. One witness was a French professor, Georges Villers, who describes the roundup of the Jewish children in the summer of 1942. And he goes to Tromsø to see these children. He manages to get in to visit them or to be with them. And of course, they're there without their parents. They've been separated from their parents. The parents have been deported. The children have been held back. Eventually, they will be deported. And this is what he tells the court. The children slept over 100 to a room on straw mattresses on the ground, mattresses which were filthy, disgusting, and full of vermin, many with no adults allowed nearby. It was not uncommon for them to wake up during the night screaming for their parents. Some were too young to know their own names or their parents' names. Since they had already, some had been interned in other camps, the state of cleanliness was frightful. This was compounded by the waves of diarrhea that affected many of them. And he's gone to the camp with René Blum, the brother of French Premier Leon Blum, to see the children. And he describes speaking with one little boy. And he says, one boy who was remarkably handsome, with a face that was very intelligent. He wore clothes which once must have been of very good quality, rather stylish, but now in pitiful conditions. One foot was bare. We asked him about his parents, and the boy said, "My father goes to the office and Mummy plays the piano." We reassured him that he would soon rejoin his parents, though we knew the child was headed for Auschwitz. The boy showed us a biscuit he was saving for his mother. Blum bent over the little boy, who looked very happy, very engaging. He took the boy's face in his hands, this is Wellers testifying, and wanted to stroke his head. And at that moment, the child, who only a moment ago had been so happy, burst into tears. So the minute he gets a gentle touch, a loving touch, his defenses go down. Wellers then went on to say, when the time came for deportation, many of the children fought and had to be brought to the roundup place, struggling and screaming. Another description came from a magistrate, who eventually will win a seat or be appointed to a seat on the High Court. But this is well before this. His name was Moshe Beisky. You can also see his testimony on YouTube, on the internet. And Beisky was very revered because he had been given opportunities to escape. But he had been in Plaszow, a camp. Many of you may know that camp from history. If not, you may know it from Schindler's List. It's the labor camp right outside. Adjacent, now it's in Krakow, but then it was adjacent to Krakow. He had been given chances to escape, but he didn't because he knew that Amnon Goth, the commandant of Plaszow, would apply collective punishment, probably death, to the other 80 prisoners in his barracks. So he enters the witness box, and the first thing Moshe Landau says to him, "You may sit if you want." And Beisky says, no. Obviously, he's a man of the court, and he believes the court deserves the dignity of someone giving testimony in standing. And he describes for an hour of what it was like to be in Plaszow. And he says, at one point, 15,000 prisoners were ordered by SS men armed with machine guns and bayonets to watch as a young boy was brought to be hanged. The child was lifted up to the gallows, but the rope broke. He was again lifted on a high chair, which was placed under the rope. The child then began to beg for mercy. An order was given to hang him a second time. So Beisky has just finished this when Hausner pounces. Hausner interrupts him and says, 15,000 people stood there, and opposite them hundreds of guards. Why didn't you attack? Why didn't you revolt? And you suddenly see this man who has been so articulate. He wasn't only speaking in full sentences, but he was speaking in full paragraphs, really speaking very well. Suddenly he begins to grope for words. And you listen to this tape, and it's very striking. He goes, "This was already in the third year of the war. Nevertheless, we still had hope. Here were people working on forced labor. They apparently needed this work, possibly, maybe." And then he stops mid-sentence, and he turns to Judge Landau, to Moshe Landau, and he says, "May I sit?" And he sits down, and he goes on to say, "I cannot describe the terror-inspiring fear. Nearby was a Polish camp. There were 1,000 Poles in it. 100 meters beyond the camp, they had a place to go, their homes. I don't recall one instance of escape on the part of the Poles, but where could any Jew go? We were wearing clothes which were dyed yellow with yellow stripes. In the center of our hair, they made a strip, a kind of swath 4 centimeters wide. And at the moment, let us suppose that the 15,000 people within the camp even succeeded without armed strength to go beyond the boundaries of the camp. Where would they go? What could they do? I have to say, on a personal note, after I read heard that testimony and then read it and then sought out the actual clip of him testifying, I copied it and put it in my teaching file on my when I teach about resistance, because young American students, strong, et cetera, well, why didn't they fight back? And I always find that that's a very powerful answer. Many people, including Hannah Arendt, whom I'm going to speak about in a minute, criticize Hausner for that question, for asking that in that way. But I don't think he meant it, in a way of saying, why didn't you resist as many as, if only they had fought back. What he wanted to show, and he knew Beisky would answer this way. I mean, Beisky didn't know he was going to ask the question. He later told him, Beisky said, why didn't you warn me you were going to ask that? He said, because I wanted an unrehearsed answer. He wanted to show, for Hausner, this trial also had an educational end. And there will be those maybe later, when colleagues from the law school, who will say, when you mix education with the trial, you get one is going to be compromised. But Hausner certainly wanted to show the desperation which people and the impossibility often of resistance. And in fact, he got supported on that from two unexpected sources. One was a woman, Zivkia Lubetkin, who was a resistance fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she had been one of the organizers of the revolt. The first armed revolt against the Germans anywhere in Europe was the Warsaw Ghetto. Not the first armed Jewish revolt, but was the Warsaw Ghetto. And she said, don't look for armed revolt. The miracle is that we refuse to become a nation of slaves. Or Abba Kovner, who was the leader of the uprising, of the aborted uprising in the Vilna Ghetto, said the question to be asked is, how was it possible there was any resistance at all? That's the miracle. There were also stories of rescue. One of the people who testified was Rabbi Melchior, the Danish rabbi. I'm sure many of you know of him, who spoke about what happened. He was actually the son of the rabbi, and he was a student at the university. And just before the rumors were out that there might well be a roundup, he went to the university to return some library books, lest he be deported and there'd be library books that hadn't been returned. We all have our priorities. Actually, as someone who likes books to be there, I appreciate that. So he came into the university and he saw some students whom he hardly knew. He knew them in passing. He hardly knew their names. And they came to him, and as he testified, he said, in case there is anything at all which you think we can reasonably do to help you, you must get in touch with us. And then he went on to describe the way Jews, his father warned them in the synagogue, of course, I'm sure you know the story, not to go home on the night of Rosh Hashanah, go to their country homes, go to other homes, and to escape. And Melchior went on to say, during the preceding 3.5 years of the occupation, there was not a single moment when the population of Denmark was united so closely together as during the rescue of the Jews. And there was a famous journalist, Chaim Guri, who covered the trial and then wrote a very, very good book about it. And he describes hearing this testimony, and in front of him a woman is sitting and weeping. So he leans over and he says, can I help you? Is anything wrong? And asks, why are you crying now? This is such an uplifting story. And she says, she's a survivor, I cry whenever someone is kind to me. There was another moment of great drama at the trial, and that was when the Reverend Dr. Heinrich Gruber from Berlin, the Protestant dean of Berlin, testified. He had negotiated with Eichmann a number of times to try to get Jews who were baptized out of camps, out of arrest, to allow them to leave, etc. And he described Eichmann as a block of ice, a block of marble, And everything you tried to get through to him bounced off of him. And he negotiated with him many, many times. Servatius tried to poke holes in his testimony by reading excerpts from one of the Protestant newspapers in Berlin, one of the evangelical newspapers, and which were quite anti-Semitic, as if to say, what are you complaining about? These are your colleagues. These are the people you worked with, and look at what they're saying. And Gruber would have none of it. He told Servatius, it's one thing to be enthusiastic about National Socialism in 1933, and quite another to facilitate murder, as Eichmann had done. He finishes his testimony, and he turns to the judge and said, I'd like to say something. And the judges say, of course, and he says, as the first German citizen to stand before this high court, and one who has found it very hard to come here, my heartfelt prayer is that we see to it that forgiving love in Israel and forgiven sin in Germany shall meet before the throne of God. And the Israelis embraced him in a way that was overwhelming. He was inundated with letters, with cards, stopped on the street. And as Martha Gellhorn, writing in The Atlantic, she covered the trial very well, she said, one good man redeemed a nation. Maybe a little bit hyperbole, but one of the striking things that in Gruber in his testimony, he talked about a man. And by the way, he himself had been in a concentration camp, had been so badly beaten that when he returned home, he couldn't even walk up the stairs. But at one time, he was describing a man who had helped Jews during the war. Talked about someone in Berlin who had helped Jews during the war. He said, but I don't want to say his name because it might cause him some trouble. And the judges didn't understand this. It caused him trouble? Isn't this something to be proud of? He said it's something to be proud of, but today in Germany, if people knew that he had helped Jews, it could cause him some trouble. Just a few more on the witnesses. There were very, very powerful witnesses. There was one, Martin Foldi, a Hungarian Jew, who described how he had arrived at Auschwitz. He had been sent to the side of people who would be allowed to live, and he saw his wife and his children go off to the other direction. And he said, I was able to keep them in my eyesight as they walked almost a half a kilometer away. And the judges said, well, how could you recognize them? Because so many people. He said, because just before the Nazis arrived, we had bought my daughter a new red coat. And I could follow her in the red coat. And of course, if you've seen Schindler's List, the red coat makes that appearance there. Eichmann defense, of course, was that he followed orders. He never acted on his own initiative. He didn't remember when he made the plan. His idea was Madagascar, or he was one of the who pushed for it, that the Jews should be brought there, that it was really to allow them to escape the morass they were in. Of course, the morass had been created by people such as Eichmann. But of course, had they gone to Madagascar, it would have been a slow death, not a quick death. Now, the judges had a very different view of the trial than did Hausner. The judges wanted a narrowly constructed legal trial. Hausner, of course, as I've said before, wanted a broad, exhaustive trial. But probably the most dramatic moment of the trial, let me mention this and then just turn for a moment to more than a moment to the story of Hannah Arendt. Probably the most riveting moment, and I've read the whole transcript of this trial, is the judge's cross-examination. The way it works in Israeli courts is after the defense and the prosecutor have presented their cases, the judges ask questions of the person on trial to make sure they fully understand. So there's nothing left open to question. So Omer Bartov, the historian, calls it one of the most fascinating documents about the Holocaust in existence. So Rave is the first one to start. And what Chaim Guri, the journalist I mentioned earlier, calls it an academic debate in a slaughterhouse, because he begins to ask him about Kant's imperative, to always act as if your actions could be raised to the status of general legislation. And Eichmann said, I believed in Kant's imperative. And so he said, well, what happened during the trial? He said, well, during the final solution, I couldn't completely live by it because I had to follow orders of the state. Then Halevi begins to ask him. And he says to him, now, he has in a sort of matter-of-fact way, you weren't an anti-Semite, were you? And Eichmann says, oh, no, of course not. Personally not. And then Halevi says, and in fact, you helped some Jews. He said, yes, I had an Aunt Dorothy who was married to a Jew, and her daughter was a Mishlinga and was supposed to be deported, so I made sure she could get to Switzerland. And then he said, and there was a Viennese couple I helped too. Of course I authorized this. I had no innate hatred of Jews. And then he goes on to say, and those weren't the only cases. And Halevi, as soon as he says that, says, so when you wanted, you could ignore your oath and act according to your human instincts. And with that exchange, I would argue that his defense collapses. And immediately he knows he's trapped, and he says, well, there are only a few cases. And Halevi says, no need to apologize, no need to apologize. And of course, then he also is going back to Rave's question about the Kantian principle. He knew his actions were wrong. If you allow certain people to escape, if you try to hide your actions, you certainly know they were wrong. Finally, Landau gets to ask, thank you. Landau is the final one to ask questions, and he says to him, because Eichmann was the one who wrote up the protocols of the Wannsee conference. He takes the notes and he writes them up. So Landau says, how come there was not any mention of the methods of killing in the Wannsee protocol? And is that because you didn't want word to get out? And Eichmann says, no. Heydrich only wanted the main points, the most important points included in protocol. And Landau, who does not lose his cool at all during the trial, is flabbergasted, and he says, you mean the methods of killing were not important? And Eichmann has a very weak answer. And they bring in the tapes that of conversations he's made with German expats in Argentina in the 50s. They won't let the tapes in, but they'll let he had handwritten on some of the manuscripts. So the comments are there, and he's very proud of what he does. Whenever I got an order, I carried it out. I enjoyed doing it. Whenever I received orders to proceed, I did the most that I could, etc. Finally comes the time for the decision by the judge. The trial ends in August. The decision is given in December. And the justices start first by saying this was not a new crime. They address Servatius's objections. But this was not retroactive justice. This was not a new crime. And Eichmann knew his acts were wrong because he tried to hide them. Of course, Eichmann kept arguing, all I did was arrange timetables, and they show, of course, that he did far more than that. The judges found him guilty only for the things in which he was directly involved. And they berated Hausner for bringing in all sorts of other issues. When it came time for them to announce sentence, Landau begins by noting that the penalty for, in this case, he'd been found guilty, was up, and according to Israeli law, you don't have to give the most severe penalty. When it's a penalty, it's up to that penalty. Of course, in this case, it's the death penalty. And so when people first heard this in the beginning of Landau's presentation, they thought, oh, maybe he's not going to get the death penalty. But he said, we didn't have to give the death penalty. We chose to give the death penalty because we feel it is deserved. what about Hannah Arendt? The whole evening could be about that. You know, her criticism and praise of her rendition of the trial. She goes, of course, to cover it for the New Yorker magazine, one of the most important publications in the United States. People say it's tasteless, perverted by vanity, deeply biased. Others say it's brilliant, it's wonderful, it's terrific, etc. Who was she? Of course, she was a highly acculturated German Jew in the early 30s, shortly after the Nazis come to power. She works for the Zionists. She helps, and then when she's told she might be arrested, she goes to Paris, where she helps German children get to then Palestine. And eventually she comes to the United States, and she writes her Origins of Totalitarianism, which get a tremendous attention, and she becomes quite a personality. Her view of the trial was that this was not a crime against the Jews, but it was a crime against humanity perpetrated on the Jews. She also saw it as a new crime and not as a chain of a persecution, as Hausner had called it. She felt most of the witnesses were irrelevant, and actually the judges agreed with her. But she also did certain things like, and this is in her letters, not in her article. Before the trial, she writes letters from Israel to Jaspers, to Mary McCarthy. She writes things that sound almost, and that almost may not be necessary, anti-Semitic. She writes, honest and clean people here are at a premium. There are Jews with payas, side curls, and kaftans who make the life impossible for everyone. But the judges, here she says, the judges are the best of German Jewry. Hausner, on the other hand, is a typical Galician Jew, one of those people who don't know any languages. Now, he was conducting the trial. Hausner was conducting the prosecution in Hebrew, Yiddish, one time in English, German, Polish, I believe also Ukrainian, so it's hard to know to say they didn't learn any languages or know any languages. I think what she said is what she meant was his German wasn't perfect, and that's not knowing any languages. She also talked that he spoke German with an accent, which is a weird thing because her mother was a Russian Jew who spoke with a heavy accent. So it's just a strange, she complained about the trial being in Hebrew. Everything should be in German. Hebrew was the language of the country. She, of course, her most controversial comments are when she talks about the Jewish councils. And she talks about them as collaborators, and she writes, if the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million. And she says this collaboration of the Jewish councils and the ghettos was the darkest chapter of the Holocaust. Now, she ignores the fact that there were no councils in the Soviet Union where over 1 million Jews were shot. And she treats all the council's members with the same broad brush. Some were terrible, Rumkowski, and some really worked with the resistance and tried to save Jews. She claims that the topic of the councils hadn't been raised because Ben-Gurion didn't want to embarrass Adenauer. I don't know how it would have embarrassed Adenauer. If anything, Adenauer probably would have been very happy to show Jewish collaboration. And then most of all, she's critical of the Sonderkommandos, the Jews who worked in the gas chambers. And she said they did the actual work of killing, but it's no moral problem because, which she says is without any proof, the SS chose the criminal elements for this job. So the people who pushed people into the gas chambers and took out the bodies afterwards. She ignores the fact that about every 8 weeks, maybe a little more than that, these people would be gassed themselves because they knew too much. The most powerful answer to her comment on the Sonderkommandos comes from Primo Levi. And he may have been writing, he writes after the trial, he may have been writing in direct response to her, we don't know. And he writes, no one is authorized to judge them, not even those who lived through the experience of the lager, and even less those who did not live through it. Here's Levy again writing, I would invite anyone who dares pass judgment on the Sonderkommandos to imagine, if he can, that he has lived for months or years in a ghetto, tormented by chronic hunger, fatigue, promiscuity, and humiliation, that he has seen die around him one by one his beloved, that he is cut off from the world, unable to receive or transmit news, that finally is loaded on a train 80 or 100 persons to a boxcar, that he travels through the unknown blindly for sleepless days and nights, and that he is thrown at last into the walls of an indecipherable inferno. Let him judge that person. So again, she's glib about things. She gets some things very, very wrong. She writes, she's a serious scholar, but she writes as a journalist not taking things as seriously as she should. And she gets Eichmann wrong. She falls for Eichmann's presentation of a bumbling kind of bureaucrat when he was not that at all. On the other hand, there's another side of Arendt, and let me finish with this. She says the kidnapping was justified. She says the trial should be in Israel, in which the injured parties live. And in fact, when Jaspers writes to her mentor, her friend, about maybe the trial shouldn't be in Israel, she writes back to him, listen to her language. We kidnapped a man who was indicted in the first trial in Nuremberg. We abducted him from Argentina because Argentina has the worst possible record for the extradition of war criminals. We did not take the man to Germany, but to our own country. Strong statement. And she said, Israel has the right to sit in judgment on the crimes committed against their people, as the Poles had to judge crimes committed in Poland. The charge that Jewish judges would be biased, she said, was unfounded. And she found the claim that Israel did not exist at the time to be formulistic and out of tune with reality. And then finally, and with this, the last comment about her, she gives the best, I think, rationale for the trial. And it's ironic because this is coming from someone who was seen so critical of the trial. But she writes as follows. What was the importance of this trial? For the first time since the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Jews were able to sit in judgment on crimes committed against their own people. For the first time, they did not need to appeal to others for protection and justice, or fall back on the compromised phraseology of the rights of man, rights which, as no one knows better than they, were claimed only by people who are too weak to defend their rights and enforce their own laws. It's a powerful statement. She also writes about those Germans who helped Jews. In one point, she writes about a man named Anton Schmidt. Abba Kovner, the leader of the Vilna Ghetto, talks about Anton Schmidt. Anton Schmidt was a German policeman in Vilna who was so appalled by what the Germans were doing that he got money to the resistance fighter, he got them uniforms, he helped them. Eventually, he's caught and he's killed. And Kovner tells this story, and Arendt describes it as follows. A hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out, clearly, irrefutably, beyond question: how utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all the countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. And then she goes on to say, many Germans, probably an overwhelming majority of them, must have been tempted not to murder, not to rob, not to let their neighbors go off into the doom, and not to become accomplices in all these things by benefiting from them. But God knows they learned to resist the temptation. And she wrote, most people will comply with terror such as this, but some will not. The final solution could have happened in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. And that certainly was a powerful indictment. So what is the, and let me end with this, the impact of this trial, as I've said before, certainly the term Holocaust comes into use, because that's what the translators use, but more importantly, the growth of a study of a field. The field didn't really exist, and the growth of historians who begin to work on this, so by the end of the 60s are producing work, is immense. Germany is forced to address its own war criminals, and of course you have the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trial. But most importantly, never before, until this day, had the destruction of European Jewry gotten such attention, been taken so seriously, and most importantly, never before had the witnesses had a voice. So while they didn't have a legal role, the judges dismissed their legal role and referred more to documents. Certainly today, when we talk of survivors, I know there are no more Norwegian survivors alive, but I saw the elements of their testimony today in the center. I saw some of the videos of them. When we talk about speaking in the first person singular, when we talk about listening to the voices of those who've experienced this, that in great measure begins with the Eichmann trial. Thank you very much. Thank you. Come back.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. We will have comments from two discussants. This is first Hans Petter Graver. He is a professor at law at the University of Oslo. He has published a number of books and articles in administrative law, legal theory, and sociology and history of law. His main interest is in the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary in authoritarian settings. And second, we have Bernt Hagtvet. He's a professor of political science at the Bjørknes University College. He has written and edited a number of books on European politics, extremist movements, genocide, and human rights. So please, Hans Petter Graver.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this most inspiring lecture, raising profound, important issues. And even though the topic and the story has been told before, it still maintains its great relevance to the present-day discussions. I would like to address 4 points, but I'll address them briefly because I know time is running short. I would like to say a little bit about standing and impartiality, which you mentioned which was discussed on the Eichmann trial. I would like to address the issue of the voice of the survivors, and then say something about political trials, using trials for political purposes, and finally a short comment on Eichmann himself and the importance of Eichmann. When it comes to standing and impartiality, of course it is a problem, and it was raised as a problem of Jews sitting in judgment against the perpetrators of Holocaust. I would like to draw the parallel to our own situation, the Quisling trial and the treason trials after the war, which raised exactly the same issues. The president of the court in the trial against Quisling was Erik Solheim, who was a member of the Supreme Court, who were in conflict with the National Socialists initially in the beginning of the occupation in 1940, who had to leave his office, who was a member of the legal committee of the civilian resistance movement, and who participated in drawing up the legislation that was used as a basis for the retribution trials after the war. So the issue of impartiality and having an impartial position was raised exactly in the same way in the Norwegian trials. We see this perhaps more clearly now, 70 years afterwards, than they did at the time. And my comment is that in this type of trials, after this type of historical incidents, I think it's impossible to find impartial trials. So what we have to do, of course, is to base ourselves on the professionalism of the legal profession in giving due process, in giving a fair trial, and in assessing the evidence and applying the law in an impartial and in a balanced matter. And I think maybe the Israeli court fared better in this respect than the Norwegian courts did in the Quisling case. That is at least something we can discuss. The second point is the voice of the survivors and the use of trials to give voice to victims. And this is, of course, very important, and it's an important distinction between the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trials. It was important also in the Breivik trial after the terrorist attack in Norway, which also, in a very broad sense, gave voice to the victims, far more than was strictly necessary to find Breivik guilty of the crimes he had committed. But I would perhaps put forward the proposition that the difference here to normal trials, everyday trials, is perhaps more the difference in scale than in quality, because the victims are normally given a voice in criminal trials. So maybe the Nuremberg trials were the exception here, and not the normal situation, since one did not let the victims give voice to the victims in the Nuremberg trials. So maybe it's just a matter of scale. Of course, when you have hundreds of victims giving evidence, it seems very different from when there's a crime committed against one victim who is given his or her voice in the trial. The third point, political trials, is perhaps more problematic, the use of trials to educate and to write history. Otto Kirchheimer, in his book Political Justice, states that trials are not the best ways of writing history. And I think the use of trials for writing history and for educative purposes can be problematized both from the point of view of history and from the point of view of justice. From the point of view of writing history, there is, of course, the bias in trials in that the litigants are in control over the evidence. So the evidence that is presented to the judge is controlled by the litigants, which is very, very different, of course, from other ways of writing history, because the litigants have their own interests, they have their own perspective, and they will design the trial in a way that is binding to the judge. So the verdict will be based on this evidence. And any trial, of course, is influenced by the rhetorical situation. It's no coincidence when we have a trial. It's not like an historian sitting, writing his or her, doing his or her research in a calm situation, because a trial is always a social and political happening. So the rhetorical situation influences the way the evidence is perceived. And thirdly, the whole basis for the assessment of evidence is framed by the law. So the law decides the relevance of different issues that are presented. So from the point of view of history, I think Otto Kirchheimer is quite right. Now, the Holocaust, of course, is unique in this aspect, since it has been litigated so many times. It's been litigated in Nuremberg, in the Eichmann, in the Irving trials. So maybe in this case we have a multiplicity of trials which can give a broader basis than normal one-instance trials. From the point of view of justice, when one uses a trial to write history, one comes, of course, close to show trials. And this is a problem if the objective of writing history takes precedence over the objective of meting out justice. And I think that all trials, in a way, do have an entertainment and an educating aspect. And the importance there is, one cannot avoid it, but the importance is to respect then that the law and the giving of justice must take precedence, and that the educative side should never take precedence, and the judges should be independent in their performance and should not be staged or used for purposes outside of this. But once these conditions are met, any trial, of course, does contribute to our perception of history and does have other aspects than just giving justice. The fourth point on Eichmann, and this is, of course, it is an interesting aspect in the discussion on Eichmann and in the discussion between Arendt and Deborah Lipstadt here, was he a zealous perpetrator, or was he the correct and nondescript bureaucrat? And I think your arguments are very convincing in your book and also in your lecture now. But nevertheless, I think it's important to maintain that he was a desktop perpetrator. He was a bureaucrat. And that is, in my opinion, the great historical importance of the Eichmann trial. It shows the importance, it symbolizes the importance of the participation of the countless bureaucrats and civil servants, police, judges, and so on. So even if he was a zealot, he was also this bureaucrat, and he shows that any regime is dependent upon the participation of the bureaucrats, and that is, in my view, the most important legacy of the Eichmann trial. Well, thank you.
Deborah Lipstadt didn't mention the famous concept of the banality of evil, but I would say that if you read the book, you will see that one of the few professional historians who could regard this exclamation, which is a very peripheral part of her work, in a matter-of-fact and nuanced way. It does throw interesting light on the person of Eichmann, and this will be my main point. Professor Lipstadt, how can you explain that the man took up every issue with the SS Colonel Sassen, simply confessed everything? Was it money? How can you explain that his widow, or his presumed widow, took the names of Eichmann to her sons? Were they completely trustful about Argentine? They think that they were completely safe. Eichmann has left his own memoirs, but most importantly, he confessed everything to Sassen. And this contrast between the interviews with Wilhelm Sassen in the 50s and his defense strategy in Jerusalem I find fascinating. I think that Eichmann expected to be shot in the ditch. And when he was taken to this safe house, he realized that he had a chance. And his defense strategy was clear-cut from the beginning. Deny everything until you are confronted with a document showing your guilt. And if you read the transcripts from Avner Less, the man who interrogated Eichmann, they are fascinated because Avner Less couldn't disclose too much of the strategy of the prosecutor. So it's a strange exchange between Eichmann and Avner Less. And to show which kind of person we are confronted with, there's one episode. Eichmann tried to ingratiate himself with the Israeli captain. So one day he said, Herr Hauptmann, what happened to your family? They were all sent to Auschwitz. Oh, how is it possible? How awful. You know, pretending that he had normal human emotions. And that kind of exchange. I'm told, I've read that when he witnessed executions, he threw up, he puked. He couldn't face the concrete examples of evil. So which kind of man was he? Was he a bureaucrat? Yes. My colleague Hans-Peter, of course, is right about that. But the main important lesson by Hannah Arendt is the question, is there in totalitarian and authoritarian regimes a new kind of personality? People who do not really realize what they're doing, she uses the word thoughtlessness, or who can do whatever evil things you can imagine without feeling any remorse. No remorse. The basic conclusion, I think, of Professor Lipstadt's book is that she shows that Eichmann was an active, planning, important cog, but also more than a cog, because if he had only been a cog, he would not have survived in the wicked, onion-like structure of the Third Reich. Thank you so much for your excellent debate.
Nei. Det lyd? Ja. Nei. Thank you very much, both, for the comments. If Deborah wants to say
I thought the comments were terrific. How can I... No, I think that the comment on the cog, by the way, one of the things she says, even if he was a little cog, it's not a good excuse, because if you have a machine and you take out a little cog, the machine won't work. So every cog is necessary in that sense. And the banality of evil, as you suggested, was a subtitle that her husband gave over dinner. She needed a subtitle. And she wasn't talking about the evil that was banal, but that banal people such as Eichmann did this thing. So I think that she was skewered unfairly for that comment.
Yeah.
And,
I talked for a long time, so I'll be quiet.
Yeah, but also the comments from Graver, especially on the survivors.
Yes. The impact of survivors and the trial gives them that room. What's interesting is here's the one place the judges got what happened wrong. As you well know, and as I talk about in my book, they said, well, the witnesses were interesting for history, but that they don't count. What counts are the documents. And ironically, or interestingly, what we know today are the witnesses, and the documents have sort of been set aside. So that's where the one thing where they get it wrong. But you're right that as you had the trial here, and it gives the chance for the victim to speak out. But you're also the scale. I think the scale, you're absolutely right. The scale is overwhelming, but the scale of what happened is overwhelming. And of course, Eichmann becomes a stand-in for all the people they couldn't get.
Interestingly enough, there was a lot of resistance from Jewish people against holding the trial. And for example, the publisher Victor Gollum, they feared that this would increase anti-Semitism. How would you say, was there anything to their reaction?
No, I don't think so. No. You know, look, as you and I have been speaking of since I arrived, anti-Semitism is irrational.
Yeah.
You know, if blonde people, a blonde person, use an example from this part of the world, did something to me and I hated all blonde people, you would say I was crazy, you know? So it's an irrational hatred. It's a prejudice, prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. No. I think the people who criticized it, and there were certainly American Jews who criticized it very strongly, were frightened. Were frightened. They were what my generation sort of calls rather contemptuously the Schachtel Jews, the don't make a fuss Jews, you know. And this will call attention to something. I think on that sense, Israel got it right. I think Hausner was way too broad. I think he should have been more focused. But the fact that they did what they did, I think that they proved that. I think most of those Jews were highly assimilated but identifying Jews, but they were sort of looking over their shoulder. What might people say? Yeah.
And the reaction by The Nation, the conservative editor, what's the name again? The Catholic.
Yes.
Buckley.
Yes.
He said that you shouldn't touch this, and this only serves to increase to increase resistance to the United States.
Right.
That's an amazing argument.
It's a crazy. It's a strange argument. Yeah. I think what is striking is that many of the critics, in the end, were convinced that it was well done and it was fair. Yeah. And I think that's, again, the reason why Arendt created such a reaction, because people had a positive feeling, and she came with this response.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the main problem is the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy of the background to the trial. I mean, the kidnapping of Eichmann and so on. And, but the actual holding of the trial, I think, is difficult to criticize from a perspective of legitimacy. The retroactivity as well, which you find in all this type of trials, and it's in many countries the prohibition against retroactivity is not basically a legal prohibition, but it's a moral prohibition. Right. So it's a question of balancing two moral principles: the principle of retribution and the principle of avoiding retroactivity. Right.
Right. But this came up in the Nuremberg trial as well. Robert Jackson, the prosecutor in Nuremberg, said, retroactivity or not, these are crimes that humanity always has condemned.
That's
right. So he simply
this is nothing new. Right.
He threw away that issue.
And the judges repeat that.
Yes.
These are not new
Robert
crimes.
Jackson, exactly
right,
the same.
Right.
Right.
But that is basically a moral and not a legal argument.
That's a moral argument, yeah.
But Deborah Lipstadt, what was then the impact of the Eichmann trial? I mean, it was actually a turning point.
It's a turning point. It puts the Holocaust out in front.
Absolutely.
It's certainly a turning point in young Israelis, post-war Israelis who were teenagers, 20s, when this trial takes place. They had always thought of the survivors as weak, ghetto Jews, you know, irrespective of the fact that many of the survivors got off the boats and went straight to fight in the War of Independence, you know. And suddenly they saw, many of them write about this, that there but for fortune go you or I, or that the fact that they were where they were was a geographical and a chronological fluke. If they had been there, that these were not weak, and so I think that changed it. In fact, in Israel, up until that point, and it really stops, it peters off, the slang name for a survivor was sabonim, soaps. People have been made into soaps, and suddenly they stop, and there's a difference in attitudes. And I think the voice of the survivor, when I sat there in that meeting and those women said, you can't do that, and the authority they had, here was, you know, I don't know how many kilos of hair been sent by Auschwitz to put on display, a case had been, it would have been a very powerful, and you have Raoul Hilberg making this argument that you must show it. And that could have been my mother's hair.
That's it.
Yep.
Yeah, of course, it did change the German perception of their past.
Yes.
That's very important. Say something about that.
Well, the videos, the tapes of the trial were shown in Germany, and people began to say, oh my God, it really must have happened. It really must have been that bad. Now, of course, when the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials take place, it's terrible in the way the witnesses are treated. It's a very disturbing kind of thing. But still, amongst the German, it won't be again, what will happen in a much stronger way, it's ironic, will be NBC Holocaust, the soap opera from the 70s, which will really jolt the Germans. But there are many Germans who are riveted, and that brilliance of taping, of making the videotapes of the trials.
Yes.
But you also say that we have this impression that the survivors hasn't been speaking about their story. But this is another impression. Maybe you can tell...
okay, well, it's relative. You know, they had been speaking, but not with the force they spoke out after that. Right. There had been those who had speaking, but more spoke out. Not everyone. Remember, at this point in 1960, some of the survivors are 30s, 40s. That's, first of all, it's not an age in normal circumstance where you're writing your memoirs, where you're looking back. And many of them, my life was destroyed, my family was taken, I am going to rebuild, and that's my focus. Many don't begin to really write or speak till they have grown children, and some have told me, I've seen this in interviews, until they have grandchildren. Because children can be a fluke. You have children. Once you have grandchildren, you know you've survived. And but it's relative. It wasn't like there was silence and nobody spoke and then suddenly everybody spoke. People had spoken, but more spoke now, and the difference is many more people listened now. And I think maybe we focused on the survivors, but they now had an audience in the best sense of the word.
I think there's another aspect which was very interesting in what you said, was the role of Fritz Bauer.
Yes, the hero.
Sitting there.
A great lawyer.
A great lawyer, but he was a prosecutor in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, and he tried for years to bring the perpetrators to justice, and he used the Israelis in a way to bring Eichmann to trial and to get these trials started.
Right.
And so I think his personality and his history is very interesting, but it's also very interesting how it puts to light the network of old Nazis permeating the Federal Republic of Germany after the war, and the dualism of this country.
That's right.
Where you have the old Nazis in position, protecting each other, enacting new legislation to ensure that there were no wider consequences of the Auschwitz trials and so on, and at the same time building democracy. I mean,
That's
it's fascinating.
I don't know how it is here in Norway, because you're so close to the scene and you had your own experience with this, but in North America, there's certainly a sense that May 45, it ends, and all the Nazis disappear. Yes. You know, they're gone, they're finished, and everything now is. It's not like.
Yeah, and Bauer committed suicide in disappointment
of the Auschwitz Frankfurt trial.
Yeah, partly because he was homosexual and he felt, persecuted by his colleagues. But it's very interesting. There are several films made of him.
Recently, now there have been two films.
But then Lipstadt, as you said, that the Nazis did not disappear.
No, they did not disappear. And I think the tapes, who asked about the Sassen tapes? I don't remember.
I did.
Okay. I hardly remember what I said, much less what. When first of all, those people listening, those German expats, many of who would come to Argentina in the 20s, even the 30s, they don't think that when Eichmann begins to talk about the Holocaust, it didn't happen. And he says, no, it happened, and we're very proud of it, and it's a good thing. Some of the seeds of Holocaust denial begin there, as Bettina Stanglis in her book Eichmann Before Jerusalem. But I think there's a real sense then, 50, 55, 56, that maybe we can reestablish this. Maybe we can somehow come back to power.
Fourth Reich.
Yes.
Exactly, right. But what about this interesting development in German jurisprudence? At the time of Eichmann, German courts could not condemn or judge anyone if you couldn't prove that he or she had shot or struck or actively participated in. And then you have the Jen Jarmond case and now the Grüner case. It's an interesting development because now you can't, not many left, you can be sentenced if you only are present in Auschwitz.
You used to
like Oskar Grüner.
No, that was a question of statute of limitation.
Yes.
And this was, at least some people believe, the result of a very subtle strategy by old Nazis in the Ministry of Justice, because they made a change to the German criminal code, lowering the maximum sentence for contributing to a crime. And this meant then that these crimes of murder were suddenly then struck by the statute of limitation.
Right.
And this was done consciously, probably, in order to exonerate all the people who had not then actually committed the killings themselves.
Yes.
Earlier today, you asked me questions of what yet needs to be studied.
Yes, what needs to be studied?
I think many things.
I'll repeat that now.
Many things, but I think amongst them what you just said. The role of the former Nazis in the administrative and governmental structure of Germany, of particularly West Germany, but not only, but particularly West Germany, in structuring things so that the Holocaust is not addressed, so the genocide is not addressed, so that Nazis can reestablish themselves, etc.
And the complicity of Konrad Adenauer, Hans Globke, the man who drafted the 1935 Nuremberg law with Stuttgart. And he continued to be head of the chancellery of the chancellor. It's amazing.
It's quite amazing.
I think now we'll open for the floor to 2 questions, comments. We have microphones on the side, so please raise your hand and stand up and present yourself and pose your question. The floor is open. I cannot see anything here because of the lights, so...
Yeah.
Was there a hand here?
Det var Ellen der.
Shall I stand up?
Please do stand up.
Thank you. Well, I'm Ellen Stensrud, a colleague of Guri at the Holocauststudier. Thank you first for a very moving lecture, I think, particularly pointing to the role of witnesses. What I would like you to elaborate a little bit on is the importance of time, both the time that passed between the end of the Holocaust and the trial itself. I mean, could it have happened before? Why did it not happen before? Would it have taken a different shape or different form if it had happened earlier? And then also the importance of time in our interpretations of the trial after it happened. Has that changed over time?
It's a great question. And maybe both will weigh in as well.
This is to you, so...
Yes, so I have to answer.
I will limit time. You're the main person.
I think time has a very big impact on these things. I can't say what would have happened if more time but how we look at things. The attitudes towards the Eichmann trial, the attitudes towards the Demjanjuk, the attitudes towards even the Oskar Gröning trial, the most recent one, the accountant of Auschwitz. I think time and distance play a major role. I don't know if Israel would have done it if maybe Bauer hadn't pushed them. It wouldn't have done it in the 50s. In Israel, there was food shortages in the 50s. And if you visited Israel, the idea that there are food shortages in Israel is mind-boggling. So it wouldn't have happened in the 50s. I think it came together at exactly the right time. And I think the fact that Adenauer didn't want it also made it easier for Ben-Gurion to go ahead with this.
We have one more question here from the floor, please. It's the hand here. Microphone is coming. And please introduce yourself.
Ms. Lipstadt, first let me express my personal gratitude because my way to the Holocaust studies began with your book, Beyond the Belief. My diploma project was about the American response to the Holocaust. And I probably read many of your publications, and one of the last, it's about American understanding the Holocaust, and I asked you to sign the book. And I'm making the dissertation about American historiography. That's why my question is, we know that Hannah Arendt and Raoul Helberg were not saying softly best friends, and the situation with the Eichmann trial made that they were kind of outsiders of the other society. And you know that Hilberg wrote in his memories that Hannah Arendt used his narrative without any links in her book. But why do you think the situation with Eichmann trial did not change dramatically their relations? So why didn't something change after they realized that they're outsiders of the academic society?
I think she uses his information, but sometimes she uses it in a very strange way. When he writes about Leo Baeck, the reform rabbi from Berlin, who was in Theresienstadt, who knows why people are being deported and doesn't tell because he thinks that will make... why let them be on a train now they're going to death? Maybe they would have some hope and etc. Hilberg writes about them. But he writes about Beck also critically, but he says, Leo Baeck, whom Eichmann's people called, and he puts it in quotation marks, the Jewish Führer. Yeah. When she says it, She talks about Leo Beck, the Jewish Führer. She doesn't say that it's Eichmann's people, and she doesn't put it in quotation marks. I think mainly, she uses Hilberg. She cites him often out of context. He was critical of the Judenrate. He was very critical. But she takes it a step further. He becomes persona non grata till at least 1968. I was in Brandeis when he's first invited back to speak, and survivors come to hear him very wary. Eventually, that will change dramatically. I think he holds her responsible for ruining his life for that decade, close to that decade after the book. So rather than be comrades in arms and they both become outcasts, he looks at her, and also she misinterprets much of what he says. Yeah. So, but in his book, he's very, as you say, he's very strong. And thank you for the nice comments.
One more comment. We have time for that. Yes, here. You need a microphone. It's coming from somewhere.
Øystein Hetland at the Holocaust Center. I wonder if you could say something about Eichmann's defender. What was his motivation? You said he was not a member of the Nazi Party, but did he take this job out of sort of a professional obligation, or did he actually want to improve, the situation for Germany?
There are those who suggest, I don't know firsthand or from my research, but who suggested that he was very happy to get the money.
Yeah, he negotiated the salary.
He negotiated a very high salary, which Israel had to pay. He lived well during the trial. It's hard to know.
He was the defender of the doctor's trial with Karl Brandt.
Yes. So he shows a sympathy already from the beginning. And whether he wanted the notoriety, I'm not sure. But certainly he got a good salary.
And he said that the court trial was perfect in the sense that no one could complain anything. And Eichmann had received a treatment he never gave his victims. That he said.
Yes, that's right. He did say that at the end. So that's a sense, I think, his passionate feelings about this. I mean, he argued very strongly on Eichmann's behalf. Yeah. But both the setting certainly was going to work against Eichmann, but also the documents. Hausner is at his best when he's saying, quoting, in Adolf Eichmann's opinion, we should do this, that, or the other. Eichmann writes about my office. He writes about deportations. Yeah. He was a fanatic. And if we're going to go back to Arendt, maybe she was fooled by him. She was really fooled by him. Yeah. And he puts on an act. At one point, I think it's Halevi or Ravel, I'm not sure which one, says to him, remember, the native German speakers, we know in German the predicate comes at the end of the sentence, but could you put fewer words before the predicate, He speaks in this bureaucratese, which he doesn't do in the assassin tapes at all. So he was one smart cookie, and a very smart woman and influential philosopher was fooled by him.
But Deborah Lipstadt, it's tempting to ask you, because you were actually sued. It must have been an absurd situation. You were sued by a Holocaust denier. What were your first reactions to that?
I laughed. I thought it was ludicrous, because this was a man who seemed to me very proud of being a denier. He goes to Germany. He says, we're going to sink the battleship Auschwitz. He says more women in Canada. He says more people died on the back seat of Senator Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick, then died in gas chambers at Auschwitz. He was very proud of it. So that he was suing me seemed ludicrous. Of course, then when I understood the implications, I stopped laughing. The difference, it's interesting. And in fact, I think it was the Times of London or the Guardian, I don't remember which paper, said, there was the Nuremberg trials, there was the Eichmann trial, and there was the Irving v. Lipstadt trial. When I read that, I said, oh my God. That was at the end of the trial, every day after the trial. But there was contrast, because my trial, we didn't call witnesses. My trial, we said, we're not going to prove the Holocaust happened. We're going to accept that the court recognizes that. We're going to prove that David Irving is a liar, that Deborah Lipstadt was right when she said he lies about the documents. So my trial was really talking about the relationship of history and historians and a trial and education. My trial really, and that's why I call my book History on Trial, was a triumph of history. In the sense that we had a dream team of historians, Sir Robert Evans, Christopher Browning, Peter Longerich, Robert Jan van Pelt. Yeah. And what they did is follow the footnotes. They took Irving's footnotes and they went back to the sources, and they showed in every case he lied, he twisted, he manipulated, so much so that the judge says about him, he's not only is it misleading and falsified and made up, but he's a neo-Nazi polemicist. So it took 6 years, but that was a worthwhile. Thank you.
But then we're just closing up because you're really, you're actually one of the few academics, and I think Holocaust researchers that you experience. You said that took 6 years of your life, but you also experienced a Hollywood movie made upon your historical research. And how was that then? You have to tell us, just ending up, how was it being impersonated by Rachel Weisz?
Not bad. Not bad. I thought after the movie came out that I would end up looking like her, but I don't.
But you told me that beforehand.
There are few people
She called you. She called you.
She called me, and she said, we had a long talk, our first conversation, and I spent time with her. During the film, before the filming, as she prepared, she's a real professional, and she would call me sometimes if I wasn't on the set the night before she was doing something, say these words for me, read this scene for me or whatever. Yeah. But the first conversation, about an hour conversation on the phone, and I was trying to take notes, but there were too many things going on in the conversation. But I did write down one thing, and it sits in the little bed table, on the little lamp table next to my bed. Justice needs troublemakers, and I think it found one. So I leave tomorrow, but your troublemaker leaves you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I like that very much.
Well, we know Deborah Lipstadt. I mean, she's picked up at the hotel tomorrow at 5:15
a.m.
A.m. I'm sorry. We'll give you some books on Holocaust in Norway, and I hope you can carry them. And for Hans Petter and Bernt, you will have honey. So I must say we're really honored to have you here. We wish you good luck in your endeavors and all your travels and your work on anti-Semitism now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.